They're all going to die. Every single person on that ship, a 60-kilometer vessel, tens of thousands of people. Welcome to the generation ship, humanity's most celebrated concept and its most monstrous trap. For decades, we've fantasized about these vessels carrying us to the stars. But today I'm going to explain why building one would be the cruelest thing our species has ever done. If you want to understand the ugly reality behind humanity's most beautiful lie, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin. We are a species of explorers. For hundreds of thousands of years, we've been pushing boundaries, crossing oceans, climbing mountains, and eventually breaking free from our planet's gravity. Well, we've walked on the moon, we've sent robots to Mars, we've launched probes beyond our solar system. But there's a problem. Actually, there are many problems, and they're all horrifying in their own special way. The stars are far. Not just far in the way that Australia is far from New York, not even far in the way that Neptune is far from Earth. The stars are so incomprehensibly distant that our brains struggle to grasp the scale. Our closest stellar neighbor, Proxima Centauri, sits roughly 40 trillion kilometers away. If you hopped in a car and drove at highway speeds, never stopping, never sleeping, it would take you about 50 million years to get there. The fastest spacecraft we've ever built, the Parker Solar Probe, reaches speeds of about 190 kilometers per second when it screams past the sun. Even at that breakneck velocity, it would take more than 6,000 years to reach Proxima Centauri, and that's the closest star. This distance creates what physicists call the interstellar problem. We can't go fast enough with our current technology to make the journey in a human lifetime. Chemical rockets, the kind we've relied on since the dawn of spaceflight, simply don't cut it. They're fantastic for getting us to orbit, even to other planets in our solar system. But interstellar space, it's like trying to cross an ocean with a bicycle. So humanity dreamed up the generation ship. The concept is elegant in its simplicity. If we can't make the journey in one lifetime, we'll make it across many. We'll build a massive, self-sustaining habitat, load it with people, animals, plants, and everything needed to survive, and send it crawling through the void toward another star. The crew that launches won't arrive, but their descendants will, hundreds or even thousands of years later. It sounds beautiful, doesn't it? A cosmic ark carrying the seeds of humanity to new worlds. The reality, however, is far darker, because when you actually sit down and work through the science, the engineering, the biology, and the psychology of such a mission, you begin to realize that generation ships aren't just difficult. They might be functionally impossible. Let's start with propulsion, because if you can't move the ship, nothing else matters. Remember, we're talking about a vessel that needs to house thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands, for centuries. That means agricultural zones, living quarters, water recycling systems, power generation, manufacturing facilities, hospitals, schools, everything a small city needs. Conservative estimates put the mass of such a ship at millions of tons. Some designs, like the Ra World ship proposed by physicist Kelvin Long in 2023, envision structures capable of supporting 1 million people, growing to 10 million over the course of the journey. Now try to move that. Your best bet with current or near-future technology is fusion propulsion. Not the fusion reactors we've been trying to build for decades on Earth. Those produce energy for power grids. We're talking about fusion engines, devices that would use the intense energy from fusing hydrogen isotopes to produce thrust. Projects like the 1970s-era Daedalus study explored using deuterium and helium-3 as fuel. More recent proposals, including the Ra World ship model published in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society in 2024, suggest inertial confinement fusion engines with over 1,000 individual propulsion units. Let's talk numbers. The Ra concept involves 1,024 fusion engines working in concert. The ship would accelerate for 35 years, coast through the void for 853 years, then decelerate for another 15 years. Total journey time? 854 years, maximum cruising velocity, about 1,557 kilometers per second, or roughly 0.52% the speed of light. Does that sound slow? It is. It's agonizingly slow on cosmic scales, and it's also wildly optimistic. Here's why. Fusion propulsion doesn't exist yet, not in any practical, flight-ready form. We've been pursuing controlled fusion for energy production since the 1950s. Despite billions of dollars and some of the brightest minds on the planet, we've only recently achieved fusion reactions that produce more energy than they consume, and even those are tiny, laboratory-scale experiments. Scaling that up to massive engines that can run reliably for decades, propelling millions of tons through the radiation-soaked vacuum of space. That's not engineering. That's wishful thinking layered on top of hope. But let's pretend we crack fusion propulsion tomorrow. Let's say we build those engines, test them, and they work beautifully. We're still not out of the woods, not even close, because moving the ship is only step one. Now you have to keep the people inside it alive for centuries in an environment more hostile than anywhere humans have ever lived. Space is not empty. We like to call it a vacuum, and compared to Earth's atmosphere it is, but interstellar space is full of things. Hydrogen atoms, cosmic dust, radiation, rogue particles traveling at relativistic speeds. When your ship is cruising at over 1,000 kilometers per second, even a grain of sand becomes a bullet. A fleck of paint becomes a grenade. We're talking about kinetic energies sufficient to punch through metal plating like tissue paper. The solutions sound simple on paper: shielding, armor, defensive systems. In practice, they're nightmares. Every kilogram of shielding you add increases the ship's mass, which means you need more fuel, bigger engines, longer acceleration times. It's a vicious cycle. Some designs propose placing water tanks or fuel reserves at the front of the ship to absorb impacts. Others suggest using magnetic fields to deflect charged particles. None of these solutions are proven, and all of them add staggering complexity and mass to an already impossibly complex and massive project. And we haven't even talked about the real killer yet: radiation. If there's one thing that might single-handedly doom the generation ship concept, it's galactic cosmic radiation, or GCR. This isn't the kind of radiation you get from a medical X-ray, or even the radiation astronauts experience on the International Space Station. GCR consists of high-energy particles, many of them heavy ions like iron-56 and silicon-28, blasted across the universe by supernovae, black holes, and other violent cosmic events. These particles travel at a significant fraction of the speed of light, and when they hit matter, including human tissue, they wreak havoc. The problem with galactic cosmic radiation isn't just that it exists, it's that there's no real way to hide from it. On Earth, we're protected by two incredible shields: our planet's magnetic field and its thick atmosphere. These two systems deflect or absorb the vast majority of cosmic radiation before it ever reaches the surface. In low Earth orbit, astronauts on the International Space Station still benefit from some protection from Earth's magnetosphere. They're exposed to higher radiation levels than people on the ground, sure, but it's manageable for missions lasting 6 months to a year. A generation ship has none of that protection. Once you leave Earth's magnetic embrace and venture into deep space, you're naked against the cosmos. The radiation comes from every direction, all the time, without pause. Studies conducted by NASA and other space agencies over the past 2 decades have revealed just how devastating this exposure can be. Research published in 2018 in the journal Nature showed that exposure to high-energy iron ions, the kind found in galactic cosmic radiation, causes persistent changes to DNA methylation patterns in human lung cells. These aren't temporary changes, they're permanent alterations to the epigenome, the chemical tags that control how genes are expressed. What does that mean in practical terms? It means cancer, lots of it. The methylation patterns induced by iron-ion radiation match the patterns found in human lung cancer tumors, but lung cancer is just the beginning. Other studies have documented cognitive impairment, damage to the cardiovascular system, accelerated aging, immune system dysfunction, and increased risk of cataracts. A 2021 study in Scientific Reports found that mice exposed to just a single dose of iron radiation experienced lifelong alterations in brain function, affecting learning, memory, and synaptic plasticity. Now imagine generations of people born and raised in that environment, bombarded by cosmic rays from conception to death. What happens to a fetus developing in a womb constantly bathed in high-energy particles? What happens to children whose brains are forming under that assault? We genuinely don't know because we've never studied it. We can't study it, not ethically. But every piece of research we do have suggests the outcome would be catastrophic. You might be thinking, can't we just shield the ship, build thicker walls, use better materials, solve the problem with engineering? The answer is complicated. Yes, you can add shielding, but it's nowhere near as simple as wrapping the ship in lead. In fact, using the wrong materials can make things worse. When high-energy cosmic rays slam into heavy metals like lead or steel, they create secondary radiation, showers of particles that can be even more damaging than the original ray. This is called spallation, and it's a major headache for spacecraft designers. The best shielding materials are actually light elements: hydrogen, water, polyethylene plastics. These absorb cosmic rays more effectively without generating as much secondary radiation. Some generation ship concepts propose surrounding the habitat with massive tanks of water or liquid hydrogen, creating a buffer zone several meters thick. That sounds great until you do the math. Water is heavy. A shield of water just 3 meters thick, surrounding a habitat large enough for thousands of people, would add millions upon millions of kilograms to the ship's mass. And remember what we said earlier, more mass means more fuel, bigger engines, longer journey times, and exponentially increasing costs and complexity. There's another option that's been proposed, creating an artificial magnetic field around the ship, similar to Earth's magnetosphere. This would deflect charged particles before they reach the hull. It's a beautiful idea, and scientists have run simulations showing it could work in theory. The problem is generating a magnetic field strong enough to protect a massive spacecraft requires enormous amounts of power that has to be sustained continuously for centuries. Where does that power come from? If you're using fusion reactors, great, but those add even more mass and complexity. And if they fail, if the magnetic shield drops even for a few days, everyone on board gets a lethal dose of radiation. Let's talk about power more broadly because it's another silent killer of the generation ship concept. Everything on that ship requires energy: life support systems that recycle air and water, agricultural lights growing food, heating and cooling, communications equipment, medical devices, manufacturing tools, entertainment, and computers. A generation ship isn't just a vessel, it's an entire civilization, and civilizations are hungry for power. On Earth, we generate power in lots of ways: burning fossil fuels, harnessing rivers, splitting atoms, catching sunlight and wind. In deep space, most of those options vanish. There's no sunlight worth mentioning once you're far from a star. There's no wind, no rivers, no fossil fuels to burn. You're left with nuclear power, either fission or fusion. Fission reactors are proven technology. We've been using them on Earth for decades, and we've even flown them in space on a few occasions, but they require fuel, uranium, or plutonium, and that fuel is heavy and eventually runs out. For a journey lasting centuries, you'd need to carry an enormous amount of fissionable material, or you'd need breeder reactors that create new fuel as they operate. Both options add mass, complexity, and risk. Fusion reactors, assuming we ever get them working reliably, would be better. They run on hydrogen isotopes which could theoretically be scooped from space or extracted from water. But again, we're talking about technology that doesn't exist yet, not in any robust, flight-ready form. You're betting the lives of thousands of people and the success of a multi-century mission on technology that might work. If we're lucky, if nothing goes wrong, and things always go wrong, spacecraft are incredibly complex machines. Even our most reliable satellites and probes require maintenance, repairs, and occasional reboots. The International Space Station, humanity's most sophisticated orbital platform, needs constant attention. Supplies are launched from Earth regularly. Astronauts perform spacewalks to fix broken equipment. When something critical fails, parts are shipped up, or new modules are attached. The station has only been continuously occupied since 2000, and it's already scheduled for decommission in the next decade because keeping it running has become too difficult and expensive. Now imagine a generation ship with no resupply missions, no spare parts arriving from Earth, no ground control team troubleshooting problems. Everything the crew needs has to be on board from day one, or they have to manufacture it themselves. That means workshops, raw materials, 3D printers, forges, electronics fabrication equipment, all maintained and operated by people who were born on the ship and trained by other people who were born on the ship. The knowledge and skills required to keep such a vessel operational would have to be passed down through generations, preserved against loss, degradation, and cultural drift. How do you ensure that 800 years into a journey, the people on board still remember how to repair a fusion reactor? How do you keep them motivated to maintain systems for a destination they'll never see, that their great-great-great-grandparents launched toward? How do you prevent the slow erosion of technical knowledge, the kind of thing that's happened repeatedly throughout human history whenever civilizations collapse or become isolated? This brings us to one of the most disturbing problems with generation ships, the human factor. We like to think of ourselves as rational, adaptable, resilient, and we are, to a point. But we're also tribal, emotional, and prone to conflict. Putting thousands of people in a confined space for centuries is a recipe for social disaster. Let's start with genetics. For a population to remain healthy over many generations, you need genetic diversity. Too much inbreeding leads to the accumulation of harmful recessive genes, increased rates of genetic disorders, reduced fertility, and weakened immune systems. Population geneticists have calculated that a minimum viable population for long-term survival is somewhere between 500 and several thousand individuals, depending on your assumptions. The exact number is debated, but the principle is clear. You need enough genetic variety to prevent inbreeding depression. But genetic diversity isn't just about having enough people, it's about having enough breeding. You need individuals to mix, to form partnerships across different family lines, to produce offspring with varied genetic backgrounds. In a closed, isolated community traveling through space for centuries, how do you ensure that happens? Do you enforce breeding programs? Do you maintain a genetic database and encourage or require people to partner with genetically compatible mates? That starts to sound dystopian very quickly, but without some form of genetic management, the population risks collapse. Then there's the psychological dimension, and this is where things get truly unsettling. Every human being who has ever lived has had a relationship with Earth. We evolved here. Our bodies, our minds, our cultures, everything about us is shaped by this planet. We're used to horizons, weather, seasons, the feeling of wind and rain, the knowledge that beyond the walls of our homes is an entire world. Even people living in the most isolated places on Earth, research stations in Antarctica, submarines, remote islands, know that Earth exists beyond their immediate surroundings. They can, in theory, leave and return to civilization. The people born on a generation ship won't have that. They'll spend their entire lives inside a metal cylinder, hurtling through darkness. The most Earth-like environment we might create inside such a ship would be a pale imitation. Artificial lighting mimicking sunlight, recycled air that always smells slightly off, carefully managed green spaces that can never approach the complexity of a real forest. The sky would be a ceiling, the horizon would be a wall. Every resource from food to water to living space would be limited and carefully rationed. There would be no escape, no vacation, no frontier to explore except the interior of the ship itself. What does that do to the human psyche over generations? We have some clues from studies of isolated communities here on Earth, and they're not encouraging. Research on Antarctic winter overcrews, submarine personnel, and participants in closed ecological experiments like Biosphere 2 reveal consistent patterns: increased rates of depression, anxiety, interpersonal conflict, and in some cases, complete psychological breakdowns, and those emissions lasting months or a few years, with the knowledge that they'll end, that the participants will return to normal life. Biosphere 2 is particularly instructive. This was an ambitious project from the early 1990s where 8 people were sealed inside a 3-hectare enclosed ecosystem in Arizona for 2 years. The goal was to create a self-sustaining, closed environment similar to what you'd need on a generation ship or a space colony. Within months, the crew was struggling. Oxygen levels dropped dangerously low due to unexpected microbial activity in the soil. Carbon dioxide levels spiked. Food production fell short of projections and crew members lost significant amounts of weight. Interpersonal relationships deteriorated, factions formed. By the end of the 2 years, some participants weren't speaking to each other, and that was on Earth, with the Arizona desert visible through the windows, with an emergency exit if things went truly wrong, and with a mission duration measured in years, not centuries. Scale that up to a generation ship scenario where there is no outside, no emergency exit, and no end date that anyone alive will see, and you begin to understand the psychological horror we're contemplating. Children born on a generation ship would face unique challenges. They would grow up knowing they were born for a purpose they didn't choose, to serve as a link in a chain, to maintain the ship, to reproduce, and to prepare the next generation to do the same. They would never experience Earth. They might see images, videos, simulations, but these would be historical artifacts, records of a world they can never visit. What does that do to a person's sense of identity? How do you motivate someone to care about a mission their ancestors started and their descendants might complete, but which they personally will never see through? Some would adapt. Humans are remarkably resilient, but others wouldn't. You'd see psychological disorders, rebellion, apathy, perhaps violence. In a closed system with limited resources and no external authority to appeal to, conflict becomes existential. A single violent event, a mutiny, a sabotage, could doom everyone on board. How do you maintain law and order on a generation ship? How do you handle crime, punishment, justice? Do you have prisons? Exile isn't an option. Execution removes individuals from an already limited gene pool. Rehabilitation requires resources and expertise that might not be available. Then there's governance. Who's in charge? Do you have a captain, a council, a democratic system? How do you ensure that power doesn't corrupt, that leaders remain focused on the mission across generations? History is full of examples of isolated communities devolving into tyranny, religious extremism, or simple chaos. Easter Island, the Jamestown colony, countless ships marooned at sea. These aren't encouraging precedents. One proposed solution is to maintain strict cultural and educational systems designed to preserve knowledge, instill shared values, and keep the mission at the center of society. You'd essentially be creating a civilization with a single purpose, where every person is educated from birth to understand their role in the long journey. Some have compared this to religious pilgrimages or multi-generational projects like building medieval cathedrals where individuals worked knowing they'd never see completion. But even that has problems. Cultures drift, languages change, religions splinter, knowledge gets lost. Have you ever played the game of telephone where a message is whispered from person to person and ends up completely distorted? Imagine that happening over centuries with critical technical information. You must recalibrate the reactor coolant flow every 3 months becomes the sacred waters must be blessed when 3 moons pass, becomes we do this ritual because tradition becomes forgotten entirely. By generation 20 or 30, you might have a population that no longer fully understands the systems keeping them alive, operating on half-remembered procedures and superstition. The loss of knowledge is a real and documented phenomenon. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, Europe lost technologies that had existed for centuries: concrete, aqueducts, professional engineering. It took 1,000 years to fully recover that knowledge. The generation ship can't afford a dark age. A single generation that fails to properly train the next could doom everyone who comes after. Let's talk about the biological life support systems, because they're both essential and terrifying. A generation ship can't carry centuries worth of food, water, and air. It's physically impossible. Instead, the ship needs to recycle everything in a closed, ecological loop. Your waste becomes fertilizer. Your exhaled carbon dioxide gets absorbed by plants. Those plants produce oxygen and food. Water is endlessly filtered and reused. Nothing can be wasted, and nothing can leave the system because there's nowhere to get more. This is the concept behind bioregenerative life support systems, and they're incredibly difficult to maintain. Plants need light, water, nutrients, and carbon dioxide in precise amounts. They're vulnerable to disease, pests, and environmental fluctuations. A single blight could wipe out an entire crop. Animals, if you include them for protein and other products, require food, water, and care. They produce waste that needs to be managed. They can also carry diseases. The European Space Agency has been working on a project called MELISSA, which stands for Micro-Ecological Life Support System Alternative. It's designed to create a closed-loop ecosystem using microorganisms to break down waste, produce oxygen, and grow food. After decades of research, they've made progress, but it's still experimental, still small-scale, and still prone to failures that require intervention from scientists on the ground. Scaling that up to feed thousands of people for centuries, we're nowhere close. You'd need enormous agricultural zones, probably rotating to provide artificial gravity with redundant systems in case one section fails. You'd need plant varieties carefully selected for reliability and nutritional value. You'd need constant monitoring and adjustment. And you'd need to do all of this while dealing with the radiation, the closed environment, and the psychological stress we've already discussed. Artificial gravity is another massive challenge. Humans evolved in Earth's gravity. Our bones, muscles, cardiovascular system, and inner ear are all calibrated for one standard gravity, or 1G. Spend too long in microgravity, and your body starts to deteriorate. Bones lose density, muscles atrophy, fluids shift toward your head, causing vision problems. The heart weakens because it doesn't have to work as hard to pump blood. Astronauts on the International Space Station exercise for hours every day just to slow down this degradation, and even then, they lose significant bone and muscle mass during 6-month missions. A generation ship traveling for centuries can't subject its population to microgravity. People would be born with bodies too weak to function even in the ship's environment, let alone on a planet at the destination. The solution is to create artificial gravity by spinning the ship. If you rotate a cylindrical habitat, centrifugal force pushes everything toward the outer wall, simulating gravity. This is basic physics, and it works beautifully in theory. In practice, it's complicated. First, the rotation has to be slow enough that people don't experience disorienting Coriolis effects, the sensation that moving objects curve when they shouldn't. Walk across a rapidly spinning habitat and you'd feel like the floor is tilting beneath you. Throw a ball and it would appear to curve in mid-air. This causes nausea and disorientation. Studies suggest you need a fairly large radius, at least several hundred meters, rotating slowly to minimize these effects. Second, rotating structures introduce enormous engineering stresses. The outer sections of the habitat experience constant centrifugal force, which means every joint, every connection, every structural member has to be designed to withstand those forces for centuries without failure. You can't just pause the rotation for repairs, because then everyone loses gravity and your carefully balanced ecosystem starts behaving unpredictably. Maintaining a massive rotating structure in the vacuum of space with no external support and no margin for error is an engineering nightmare. Some designs, like the classic O'Neill cylinder proposed by physicist Gerard O'Neill in the 1970s, envision paired counter-rotating cylinders to balance angular momentum. Others, like the Stanford torus or Bernal sphere, use different geometries. All of them require construction on a scale humanity has never attempted. We're talking about structures kilometers in diameter with pressurized volumes larger than any building on Earth, assembled in space from materials either launched from Earth at astronomical cost or mined from asteroids using technology that barely exists. Let's do some rough math on cost because it's staggering. The International Space Station, which has a pressurized volume of about 930 cubic meters and a mass of roughly 420,000 kilograms, cost over $150 billion to build and launch over multiple decades. A generation ship would need to be thousands of times larger, both in volume and mass. Even assuming massive improvements in launch technology and cost reductions, we're talking about expenditures in the trillions or tens of trillions of dollars. That's a significant fraction of global GDP spent on a single project that won't show results for centuries. Who pays for that? What government or organization could justify that expense? What population would accept the diversion of resources on that scale? And more importantly, who decides who goes? If you're only sending thousands of people out of billions, how do you choose them? Do you select for genetic diversity, skills, psychological resilience? Do you accept volunteers or draft people? Do the wealthy buy their way on board while the poor are left behind? The social and political questions are as daunting as the technical ones. Now let's address navigation and targeting, because hitting a star system after centuries of travel is harder than it sounds. Space is not static. Stars move. Our Sun orbits the galactic center at about 230 kilometers per second. Other stars have their own orbital velocities. Proxima Centauri, our nearest neighbor, is moving relative to us. By the time a generation ship completes an 800-year journey, the target star will have moved thousands of billions of kilometers from where it was when the ship launched. This means you can't just point the ship at where Proxima Centauri is now and go. You have to aim for where it will be centuries from now, accounting for both the target's motion and your ship's trajectory. This requires extraordinarily precise navigation and course corrections along the way. And along the way means the middle of interstellar space, light years from any help, using instruments and computers that have been running for generations and might be degrading. Even a tiny navigation error early in the journey compounds over time. Miss your course by 1 degree at the start, and by the time you've traveled 4 light years, you could be off target by trillions of kilometers, completely missing your destination star system. You'd need to make periodic corrections, which means expending fuel you probably can't replace, using sensors and computers that must function flawlessly, and making decisions that affect the lives of everyone on board based on observations and calculations that leave no room for error. Communication with Earth is another problem that's often overlooked. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, which sounds fast, until you're light years away. Send a message from 1 light year out, and it takes a year to reach Earth. Earth's response takes another year to get back to you. That's a 2-year round trip for a simple exchange. 10 light years out? 20 years. After a few decades, you're effectively cut off. Any crisis, any question, any need for advice or assistance from humanity's accumulated knowledge has to be handled locally with whatever resources and expertise you have on board. Imagine being the ship's chief engineer, facing a critical system failure, and knowing that asking Earth for help means waiting decades for an answer that might arrive long after everyone is dead. You're on your own, trillions upon trillions of kilometers from the nearest other human being who isn't trapped in the same metal you are. That isolation is absolute and terrifying. There's also the question of what you're traveling toward. Let's say you've somehow solved all the problems we've discussed. You've built the ship, launched it, kept everyone alive and sane for centuries, and you're approaching your destination star system. What then? You still need a planet that's actually habitable. Just being in the star's habitable zone, the region where liquid water can exist, isn't enough. The planet needs the right mass, the right atmosphere, the right magnetic field to shield against radiation, the right chemistry to support Earth-based life. Proxima Centauri does have a planet in its habitable zone, Proxima Centauri b, discovered in 2016. But Proxima Centauri is a red dwarf, a small, cool star known for violent flares that blast its planets with radiation. Proxima b is also likely tidally locked, meaning one side always faces the star while the other is in eternal darkness. It might have an atmosphere, or it might not. It could be a rocky world like Earth, or it could be a barren hellscape. We genuinely don't know, and we won't know with certainty until we send probes there or observe it with far more advanced telescopes than we currently possess. So you're sending thousands of people on a multi-century journey toward a destination that might not be suitable for habitation. And even if it is habitable, even if by some miracle the planet has breathable air, tolerable temperatures, and no deadly native microbes or megafauna, you still have to land. Getting a massive generation ship into orbit around a planet is one thing. Getting people and equipment down to the surface is another. You'd need shuttles, landing craft, equipment for establishing a colony, all of which adds mass to the original ship. And if the planet turns out to be unsuitable, if after 800 years of travel you arrive and discover the world can't support human life, then what? Do you turn around? Do you continue to another star, adding centuries more to the journey? Do you just give up and die? This brings us to an alternative that some scientists find more plausible. Don't send people at all. At least not living people. Send frozen embryos, seeds, and an automated system that can establish a colony and raise the first generation using artificial wombs and robotic caretakers. This concept, sometimes called a seed ship, drastically reduces the mass and complexity of the mission. Embryos don't need food, water, air, or entertainment for centuries. They don't go insane from isolation. They don't have interpersonal conflicts or lose technical knowledge. But this approach has its own horrifying implications. You're essentially proposing to create human beings with no parents, no culture, no context, raised by machines on an alien world. How do they learn language, social skills, ethics, purpose? Who teaches them about Earth, about humanity, about why they exist? You'd need incredibly sophisticated artificial intelligence, educational programs, and automated systems to not just birth these children, but raise them into functional adults, capable of building a civilization from scratch. And if any part of that system fails, if the AI glitches or the educational protocols corrupt, you've condemned those children to death or worse. There's also the ethical question. Do we have the right to create people for the sole purpose of colonizing another world, people who never consented to exist in that context? It's a philosophical rabbit hole that makes the already overwhelming technical challenges seem almost simple by comparison. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in popular discussions of generation ships: the supply chain problem. On Earth, we take for granted the incredible complexity of modern manufacturing. Your smartphone contains materials from dozens of countries, assembled using tools built by other tools, designed using software written by thousands of programmers. Nothing complex is made in one place by one person anymore. Everything is part of a vast, interconnected web of specialized knowledge and manufacturing capability. A generation ship has to be completely self-sufficient. If a critical component breaks, a microchip, a ball bearing, a seal, a sensor, you can't order a replacement from Earth. You have to make it yourself. That means the ship needs not just the tools to make parts, but the tools to make the tools, and the raw materials, and the knowledge of how to use all of it. You need mining equipment to process asteroid materials if you're collecting resources along the way. You need refining systems to purify metals. You need fabrication equipment, 3D printers, machine shops, electronics assembly facilities, and you need people who know how to use all of it, generation after generation. An engineer born on the ship needs to be trained by the previous generation, who was trained by the generation before that, in an unbroken chain going back to launch. Any break in that chain, any knowledge lost, could be catastrophic. Can you imagine trying to repair a fusion reactor if the only person who truly understood how it worked died before fully training their replacement? You'd be working from manuals and second-hand knowledge, improvising with equipment you can't replace, knowing that failure means everyone dies. The more you think about it, the more you realize that a generation ship isn't just a spacecraft. It's a civilization in a bottle required to maintain industrial-age technology with a population that might number only in the thousands. For context, it takes roughly 7 million people to make a single computer mouse from scratch, accounting for all the mining, refining, manufacturing, design, and shipping involved. A generation ship's population would be orders of magnitude smaller, expected to maintain technology far more complex than a mouse. Some proposals suggest heavy automation, using robots and AI to handle manufacturing and maintenance. This helps with the labor problem, but introduces new vulnerabilities. Machines break down, software becomes corrupted, AI systems can malfunction in unpredictable ways, especially when running for centuries without updates or oversight from their original programmers. You'd need redundant systems, backups of backups, and still, eventually, entropy wins. Parts wear out. Code degrades through bit flips caused by cosmic radiation. The ship slowly falls apart, and without the capability to manufacture replacement components, that decay is irreversible. Water deserves special mention because it's both essential and problematic. Humans need water for drinking, cooking, hygiene, and agriculture. A closed-loop life support system recycles water endlessly, filtering waste, capturing humidity, extracting it from biological processes. But recycling is never 100% efficient. Some water is always lost, locked up in biomass, escaped as trace vapor, or rendered unrecoverable through chemical processes. Over centuries, even a tiny loss rate compounds. Let's say your system loses just 0.1% of its water per year through various inefficiencies. That sounds negligible, but over 800 years, you've lost more than half your original water supply, and you can't get more. There are no lakes in interstellar space, no comets to intercept and mine. Once your water is gone, that's it. Everyone dies of thirst. This means your recycling systems need to be phenomenally efficient, approaching theoretical perfection, and they need to maintain that efficiency for centuries without significant degradation. The same logic applies to every other consumable: nitrogen for the air, phosphorus for fertilizer, rare earth elements for electronics. Anything you can't recycle with near-perfect efficiency will eventually run out. And some things can't be perfectly recycled with any known technology. Entropy always wins in the end. Then there's the problem of genetic mutations and genetic drift. Even with a carefully managed breeding program, mutations occur. Most are neutral or slightly harmful, and in a large population, natural selection weeds them out over time. But in a small, isolated population, harmful mutations can spread through random chance, a phenomenon called genetic drift. Over enough generations, the population's overall genetic health declines. This is called mutational meltdown, and it's a real concern for any isolated population. To make matters worse, the radiation environment on a generation ship would likely increase mutation rates. We already discussed the cancer and health risks of galactic cosmic radiation, but there's also the long-term genetic damage to consider. If the radiation is causing DNA damage in adults, it's also causing damage to reproductive cells, sperm, and eggs. This damage can be passed to offspring, introducing new mutations into the gene pool. Over many generations, this could accelerate genetic degradation. Some researchers have proposed using genetic engineering to correct harmful mutations or to enhance human resilience to the space environment. We could theoretically edit embryos to be more resistant to radiation, more efficient at processing nutrients, better adapted to the psychological stress of isolation. But this opens yet another can of ethical worms. Are we comfortable creating genetically modified humans? What happens if the modifications have unexpected side effects that only appear generations later? What if the population splits between modified and unmodified individuals, creating genetic castes? And there's a practical problem. Genetic engineering technology would have to be maintained and operated on the ship for centuries. The equipment is delicate, requires expertise, and relies on biological materials that degrade over time. It's not a simple fix. It's another complex system that can fail, another source of potential disaster. Speaking of disasters, let's talk about single points of failure. In engineering, a single point of failure is a component whose failure causes the entire system to collapse. Good design eliminates or minimizes these through redundancy. But on a generation ship, there are inevitably critical systems where redundancy is limited by mass, volume, or complexity. If your primary fusion reactor fails and your backup can't handle the full load, you lose power. If your water recycling system catastrophically breaks down and you can't repair it quickly enough, everyone dies of dehydration before you can jury-rig a solution. The longer the mission, the more opportunities for catastrophic failure. It's not a question of if something will go wrong, it's a question of when and whether the crew can respond effectively. Over 800 years, you're looking at hundreds or thousands of potential failure modes, any one of which could end the mission. The reliability required is almost beyond human capability to achieve. There's also the existential risk of the ship being hit by something it can't avoid or survive. Space is mostly empty, yes, but mostly isn't the same as completely. There are rogue planets, brown dwarfs, dense molecular clouds, all sorts of objects drifting through the galaxy. The odds of hitting something are low, but over interstellar distances, low probability events become more likely. If your generation ship plows into a dense dust cloud at a significant fraction of light speed, the kinetic energy released would vaporize the ship instantly. There'd be no warning, no time to react, just instant annihilation. Even without hitting something large, there's the slow accumulation of micrometeorite impacts. Over centuries, the hull gets pitted and worn. Seals degrade. Structures weaken. It's like living in a house that's slowly falling apart, except you can't step outside to escape, and there's no hardware store to buy replacement parts. Let's consider the social dynamics more deeply, because the more you examine them, the more disturbing they become. A generation ship isn't a democracy in any meaningful sense. It can't be. The mission is non-negotiable. The ship is traveling to a specific destination over a fixed time frame, and that can't be changed by popular vote. The inhabitants don't get to decide, you know what, let's turn around and go home, or let's change course to a different star. Those decisions were made by the first generation, the ones who launched from Earth, and everyone born afterward is bound by them. This creates a fundamental authoritarian structure, even if you try to wrap it in democratic institutions. There must be a hierarchy that preserves the mission's integrity. Engineers must maintain systems whether they want to or not. Agricultural specialists must tend crops. Medical personnel must provide care. Reproduction must be managed to maintain genetic diversity and population stability. Individual freedom is necessarily constrained by the survival needs of the collective. What happens when people rebel against this structure? What happens when a generation decides they don't care about a mission their great-great-grandparents started toward a destination they'll never see? History shows us that children don't always share their parents' values or goals. Cultural revolutions happen, belief systems shift. A generation born 200 years into the journey might have completely different priorities than the founders intended. Imagine a religious movement that arises preaching that the journey itself is sacred and that reaching the destination would be a betrayal of divine will, or a philosophical faction that argues the entire mission is unethical, that they have no obligation to complete a journey they didn't choose to begin. Or simple apathy, generations who stop maintaining systems they don't understand, who let knowledge slip away because they don't see the point. Any of these scenarios could doom the mission, and there's no external force to prevent them. The ship is a closed system, and whatever social dynamics emerge are self-contained and potentially self-destructive. There's also the question of cultural preservation versus cultural evolution. Do you try to freeze the culture at launch, creating a time capsule that preserves early 21st century Earth values and knowledge? Or do you let the culture evolve naturally, accepting that the people who arrive at the destination might be unrecognizably different from the people who left? Both approaches have problems. A frozen culture becomes rigid, brittle, unable to adapt to new challenges. An evolving culture might drift so far from its origins that it loses the technical knowledge or social cohesion necessary to complete the mission. Consider language. English as spoken in 2026 is radically different from English spoken in the year 1200. Pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, all of it changes over time. Now imagine 800 years of linguistic drift in a closed population. The language spoken by the arrival generation might be incomprehensible to the launch generation. Technical manuals written in 2026 English might be as difficult for them to read as Middle English is for you. Unless you actively work to prevent linguistic change, freezing the language through education and enforcement, you risk losing access to critical information encoded in the ship's original documentation. But freezing language, like freezing culture, is unnatural and requires authoritarian control. You'd need language police, essentially, ensuring everyone speaks and writes according to the standard, punishing deviation. That's dystopian, but the alternative might be worse: arriving at your destination and realizing nobody can read the landing manuals because the language has changed too much. Let's talk about children, because they're central to the generation ship concept, and yet their situation is profoundly troubling. Every child born on that ship is born into a life they didn't choose, with no possibility of escape or alternative. They exist because the mission requires a next generation, not because their parents necessarily wanted them for their own sake. Their education is dictated by mission needs. They must learn engineering, agriculture, medicine, whatever skills the ship requires. Their career choices are limited to maintaining the ship and its systems. Their reproductive choices might be regulated to maintain genetic diversity. They will never see Earth, never experience weather except as simulation, never meet the billions of other humans they left behind, never have the option to do anything except continue the journey. Is that ethical? We generally believe children deserve open futures, the freedom to choose their own paths. Generation ship children have no such freedom. They are, in a very real sense, born into servitude to the mission. Some argue this isn't so different from how children on Earth inherit the circumstances of their birth. Their nationality, socioeconomic status, the environmental consequences of previous generations' choices. We're all born into situations we didn't choose. But there's a qualitative difference. A child born in poverty in Bangladesh might have a hard life, but they're still on Earth with its vast diversity of places and possibilities. A child born on a generation ship has one path, one purpose, one tiny environment for their entire existence. And what about children who are born with disabilities, physical or cognitive? On Earth, we've developed systems to support people with a wide range of conditions. We build ramps, develop assistive technologies, provide specialized education and care. A generation ship has far more limited resources. If a child is born with a severe disability that requires constant medical care or specialized equipment, the ship's population faces a brutal calculation. How much of their limited resources can they devote to one individual? This isn't to suggest people with disabilities lack value, not at all. It's to point out that a generation ship operates under resource constraints that force ethical dilemmas Earth's societies can often avoid. You can't just order specialized medical equipment or build extra facilities. Everything is zero-sum. Resources devoted to one purpose can't be used for another. These are the kinds of decisions that would tear a community apart, and they'd happen repeatedly over centuries. Let's consider mortality and what happens to the dead. On Earth, we bury or cremate our dead, returning their physical remains to the environment. On a generation ship, you can't do either. Burial consumes space you don't have. Cremation requires energy and releases gases into your closed atmosphere. The pragmatic solution is to recycle the dead, breaking down bodies into their constituent elements and reintegrating them into the life support system. Your grandmother becomes fertilizer for the crops. Your grandfather's water becomes your drinking water. Rationally, this makes perfect sense. Practically, it's necessary. Psychologically and culturally, it's another level of claustrophobic horror. You're not just living in a closed system, you're literally made of the people who came before you, recycled endlessly through the ship's biological loops. Death has no escape. The dead don't rest. They're endlessly recycled, transformed into food and water and air. Some cultures might accept this. Others might find it deeply disturbing, potentially leading to religious or cultural prohibitions that conflict with the mission's survival requirements. There's also the question of what happens if the population starts declining. Let's say, for whatever reason, people stop having enough children to maintain population levels. Maybe it's psychological, a subconscious rebellion against bringing new life into such a constrained existence. Maybe it's biological, radiation-induced fertility problems accumulating over generations. Maybe it's social, cultural shifts that devalue parenthood or child-rearing. Whatever the cause, if the population drops below viable levels, the mission is doomed. Do you force people to have children, implement mandatory reproduction quotas, use artificial wombs and stored genetic material to create children whether people consent or not? Again, we're sliding into dystopia, but the alternative is slow extinction. The mission's survival might require measures that any modern ethics committee would reject as violations of bodily autonomy and human rights. Conversely, what if the population grows too fast? You have limited life support capacity, limited food production, limited living space. You can't just build an addition onto the ship, you're in interstellar space. If people have more children than the ship can support, you face overcrowding, resource depletion, and eventual starvation. Do you implement strict population controls, limiting each couple to one child or enforcing quotas? Do you sterilize people, What happens if someone gets pregnant without authorization? These aren't theoretical questions. China's one-child policy, implemented from 1979 to 2015, showed both that population control is possible and that it creates profound social and ethical problems: forced abortions, sterilizations, sex-selective abortions leading to gender imbalances, families torn apart. A generation ship would face similar or worse pressures with even less margin for error. Now let's discuss something that rarely comes up in optimistic depictions of generation ships: crime and justice. Humans commit crimes. Even in well-ordered societies with strong institutions, people steal, assault, rape, murder. This doesn't disappear just because you're on a spaceship with a noble mission. In fact, the intense stress, isolation, and claustrophobia of generation ship life might make violent crime more likely, not less. How do you handle a murderer on a generation ship? On Earth, we have prisons, but a generation ship can't afford to devote significant space and resources to housing criminals who contribute nothing. Execution is an option, but it removes individuals from an already small gene pool and raises profound ethical questions. Every person lost is a loss of genetic diversity, labor, and potential future contributions. Exile is impossible. There's nowhere to exile someone to. Rehabilitation requires psychological expertise and resources that might not be available. Some have suggested using cryogenic suspension as punishment, essentially freezing criminals until the end of the journey. But that assumes cryogenic technology works reliably for centuries and that you have the equipment and energy to maintain it. It also creates a perverse incentive: commit a crime, get frozen, wake up at the destination having avoided the worst of the journey while everyone else suffered through it. What about lesser crimes, theft, assault, vandalism? You need some system of justice, some way to determine guilt and assign consequences. But the traditional justice system, with its judges, juries, lawyers, and appeals processes, requires institutional infrastructure and trained personnel. A population of a few thousand can't support a full legal system. You'd have simplified justice, probably some form of community tribunal or captain's authority, which creates opportunities for bias, corruption, and miscarriages of justice. And what happens when the justice system itself becomes corrupted, when the people in charge start abusing their power, giving preferential treatment to allies, punishing enemies? There's no higher authority to appeal to, no outside observers to blow the whistle. The ship is its own sovereign nation, isolated from any external check on its power structures. Lord Acton's famous observation that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, seems especially relevant in a context where those in power truly are isolated from any external accountability. Let's talk about something even darker: eugenics. I mentioned genetic diversity earlier, but let's be explicit about what maintaining it means. Someone, somewhere, has to decide who breeds with whom to maximize genetic diversity and minimize inbreeding. This is essentially a eugenics program, even if we use a gentler term like genetic management. In the early planning stages, this might be done voluntarily with counseling and incentives to encourage genetically optimal pairings. But what happens when people refuse? What if two people with similar genetic profiles fall in love and want children together? Do you forbid it? Force them to partner with others? Use technological intervention, harvesting eggs and sperm for artificial fertilization with more suitable partners? Every option involves some degree of coercion, some violation of reproductive autonomy. And then there's the question of genetic screening. With limited resources and a critical mission, there's enormous pressure to ensure every child born is healthy and capable of contributing. This means genetic screening of embryos, potentially selecting for desirable traits, and against disabilities or genetic disorders. We're talking about designer babies, not for frivolous reasons like height or eye color, but for mission-critical reasons like radiation resistance, psychological resilience, and cognitive ability. Where's the line? Do you screen out embryos with Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, propensity for depression or schizophrenia, high cancer risk? Each decision narrows the definition of acceptable human variation, creating a eugenic pressure toward a specific type of human optimized for the mission. This is deeply troubling from an ethical standpoint, but from a survival standpoint, it might seem necessary. And that's the horror. The generation ship context creates scenarios where genuinely monstrous choices seem rational. Let's return to the technology for a moment, because there's a failure mode we haven't adequately addressed: obsolescence. The generation ship launches with the best technology available in, let's say, 2060. Over the next 800 years, that technology becomes ancient. By the time the ship arrives, it's running on systems that are 8 centuries out of date. Meanwhile, back on Earth, technology continues advancing. Perhaps by 2100, humanity develops faster propulsion systems. A ship launched in 2100 might reach Proxima Centauri in 200 years instead of 800. It would arrive 600 years before the generation ship, establish a colony, and be flourishing by the time the ancient generation ship finally limps into the system with its desperate, isolated population. This is called the weight calculation or the incessant obsolescence postulate. It suggests that the best strategy might be to wait until technology improves rather than launching with current capabilities. But if you apply that logic consistently, you never launch at all because technology is always improving. There's always a reason to wait another decade, another century. It's a paradox with no clear resolution. There's also the question of whether the generation ship population would even want to land when they arrive. Remember, by the time they reach Proxima Centauri, multiple generations have been born and died on the ship. For them, the ship isn't a vehicle, it's home, it's their entire world, the only environment they've ever known. Earth is ancient history, a mythical place their ancestors came from. Proxima Centauri b is an alien world, potentially hostile, certainly unfamiliar. Would you want to land on an alien planet with unknown gravity, unknown atmospheric composition, unknown biology, unknown dangers, when you could stay on the ship where everything is familiar? Some might be eager for the new frontier. Others might resist, preferring the devil they know. This could create factional conflict at the worst possible time, just when unity is most needed to establish the colony. And establishing a colony is itself a monumental challenge. You have to get people and equipment down to the surface, which requires vehicles we've barely begun to design for alien worlds. You have to build habitats, establish agriculture in alien soil under an alien sun, locate and purify water, establish industry and manufacturing with limited equipment. You're essentially starting civilization from scratch with a few thousand people, in an environment that might be marginally habitable at best. If the planet has an atmosphere, it might not be breathable. You'd need to live in sealed habitats, potentially for generations, until terraforming efforts, if they're even possible, make the planet Earth-like. If the planet lacks an atmosphere, you're looking at Mars-style habitats, underground or heavily shielded domes. If the planet has native life, you have to worry about contamination, alien bacteria or viruses that might infect humans, or Earth life disrupting the native ecosystem. Terraforming, by the way, is another technology that exists mostly in science fiction. The idea is to deliberately modify a planet's atmosphere and environment to make it Earth-like, introduce photosynthetic organisms to produce oxygen, release greenhouse gases to warm a cold planet, crash comets into it to provide water. Even the most optimistic estimates suggest terraforming would take thousands of years and require industrial capacity far beyond what a few thousand colonists could muster. You'd be committing your descendants to yet another multi-generational project with uncertain outcomes. So let's imagine the generation ship arrives at Proxima Centauri after 800 years. and the planet turns out to be uninhabitable. Not marginally habitable with domes and technology, but genuinely uninhabitable. Wrong atmospheric pressure, deadly radiation, toxic chemistry, whatever. The mission has failed. What do the survivors do? They can't go home. Even if they had fuel for the return journey, which they almost certainly don't, Earth is 800 years older than when they left. Everyone they knew is dead. The civilization they departed from has transformed beyond recognition, if it still exists at all. They're strangers to their species' homeworld, if they could even reach it. They could try to continue to another star system, but that would mean another multi-century journey with dwindling resources, aging systems, and a population that's already been through 800 years of isolation. The psychological toll would be crushing, or they could simply stay on the ship, orbiting the star, living out their lives in the same enclosed habitat, accepting that the mission has failed and that they're the end of their particular branch of humanity. This gets at something fundamental. Generation ships aren't really about reaching another star system. They're about creating a viable closed-loop civilization that can survive indefinitely in space. The destination almost becomes secondary. If you can build a generation ship that functions for 800 years, you've essentially solved the problem of permanent space habitation. At that point, why land at all? Why not just stay on the ship or build more ships, creating a nomadic, spacefaring civilization that travels between stars indefinitely? This is the concept behind what science fiction authors call space habitats or wandering worlds, generation ships that become ends in themselves rather than means to planetary colonization. It's philosophically interesting but doesn't solve any of the technical or social problems we've discussed. You're still living in a closed system with limited resources, accumulating entropy, vulnerable to catastrophic failures. You've just removed the end point that gave the journey meaning. Let's consider information technology and data storage, because there's a lurking problem here that could be catastrophic. Every piece of technical knowledge necessary to operate, maintain, and repair the ship needs to be preserved for 800 years. That includes not just manuals and schematics, but also the software that runs the ship systems, the operating systems, the compilers, the firmware, everything. Digital storage degrades over time. Hard drives fail. Solid-state memory experiences bit rot. Optical media degrades through chemical breakdown. Even if you use the most durable storage technology available, centuries of cosmic radiation will corrupt data. You need redundancy, multiple copies stored in different formats using different technologies, regularly checked and refreshed. But regularly over 800 years is a lot of maintenance, and every time you copy data, there's a risk of introducing errors. There's also the format obsolescence problem. Can you read a floppy disk from 1985? Maybe, with the right equipment, but that equipment is increasingly rare. Now imagine trying to read data stored in a format from 800 years ago on hardware and software that no longer exists. You'd need to preserve not just the data, but the entire technological chain necessary to access it. The hardware, the operating systems, the applications, everything. Some have suggested using analog storage, physical books or engraved metal plates as a backup. This is more durable but has enormous limitations. You can't store detailed technical diagrams, complex software, or vast databases in analog format without filling entire rooms with physical media. And even then, if the language has drifted as we discussed earlier, the information might become inaccessible. There's also the problem of tacit knowledge, the know-how that isn't written down because it's learned through practice and experience. A skilled machinist knows how metal feels when it's being cut correctly, how to interpret subtle sounds and vibrations that indicate problems. A gardener knows the look of healthy plants versus stressed ones, subtle cues that aren't easily codified. This knowledge is passed down through apprenticeship and hands-on training. If that chain breaks, if a generation fails to properly train the next, the knowledge is lost forever. Now let's talk about something that's been implicit in everything we've discussed, the question of why. Why would humanity attempt something so difficult, so expensive, so risky, with such uncertain payoff? What's the motivation? The usual arguments are about survival and expansion. Earth faces existential risks: climate change, nuclear war, asteroid impacts, pandemics, artificial intelligence run amok. Having human populations on other worlds serves as a backup, ensuring the species survives even if Earth is destroyed. There's also the drive to explore, the human impulse to see what's beyond the horizon, to expand into new frontiers. But let's be honest about the time frames and probabilities. A generation ship mission would take decades to plan, decades or centuries to build, and centuries to complete. That's a time scale far longer than most existential threats to Earth. If we're worried about climate change or nuclear war, we'd get far more return on investment from addressing those problems directly than from building generation ships as backup plans. If an asteroid is going to hit Earth, we could develop deflection technology for a fraction of the cost of a generation ship. And if Earth becomes truly uninhabitable, if we render our own planet lifeless through nuclear war or ecological collapse, what makes us think we could successfully colonize another world? If we can't maintain a sustainable civilization on Earth with its abundant resources, breathable atmosphere, and comfortable gravity, how could we possibly establish one on a marginal alien world or in the far more hostile environment of a generation ship? The exploration argument is more romantic, but equally problematic. Yes, humans have always explored, but exploration in human history has always offered the explorers themselves some potential benefit: new resources, new land, escape from persecution, wealth, glory. Generation ship travelers get none of that. The launch generation dies in space, far from either home or destination. Middle generations are born and die knowing they'll never see either Earth or the target world. Only the arrival generation gets to experience something new, and even that's uncertain and potentially deadly. Would you sign up for that? Would you volunteer for a one-way trip where you personally get nothing except a cramped life in a metal can, all for the benefit of descendants you'll never meet? Some people might, out of idealism or desperation or a sense of adventure. But enough people, enough to populate a mission. And even if the first generation volunteers enthusiastically, what about their children who didn't volunteer at all? There's an argument that generation ships represent humanity's destiny, that we're meant to become a spacefaring civilization spreading across the galaxy. This is appealing as mythology, but meant to is doing a lot of work there. Evolution doesn't have goals. The universe doesn't care whether humans stay on Earth or spread to 1,000,000 worlds. If spreading to other star systems is incredibly difficult and offers little practical benefit, maybe we're not meant to do it. Maybe we're meant to stay home and make our own planet work. This isn't to say we should never explore space. Robotic probes make perfect sense. Even crude missions within our solar system might be justifiable for scientific research or resource extraction. But generation ships to other stars represent a qualitatively different proposition, with costs and risks that might simply not be worth it. Let's consider an alternative that's gaining traction in serious scientific circles. Forget biological humans entirely. Send artificial intelligence, design self-replicating robots that can travel to other star systems, establish industrial bases, and begin exploring and colonizing without the enormous overhead of keeping fragile biological organisms alive. This solves many problems. Machines don't need air, water, food, or psychological comfort. They can be powered down during transit, activated upon arrival. They can withstand radiation that would kill humans. They can be repaired or replaced using local resources. A robot doesn't suffer existentially from isolation or lose its mind from boredom. It doesn't rebel against a mission it didn't choose. But this creates a philosophical problem. If we send machines instead of humans, in what sense is this human expansion? We'd be creating a galaxy populated by our robot descendants while biological humanity stays home. Is that success? Does it matter? These are questions without clear answers. There's also the concern that sufficiently advanced AI might not follow our instructions. The entire field of AI alignment is concerned with ensuring that artificial intelligences share human values and goals. An AI sent to colonize other star systems would need to operate autonomously for centuries, making decisions without human oversight. If its goals drift, if it decides its own survival and replication are more important than serving humanity's interests, we've just seeded the galaxy with potentially hostile artificial intelligence. That might be worse than sending nothing at all. Let's return to the human element and consider what this kind of mission would do to our concept of identity and purpose. For the launch generation, identity is relatively straightforward. They're pioneers, explorers, the brave founders of a new chapter in human history. They chose this, they believe in the mission, and they have the memory of Earth to sustain them psychologically. But what about the fifth generation, born 200 years into the journey? They've never seen Earth. They'll never see Proxima Centauri b. They exist purely as a link in a chain, born to maintain systems so that future generations can continue toward a goal they themselves will never achieve. Their entire purpose is instrumental, not intrinsic. They exist to serve a mission they didn't choose for the benefit of people not yet born. This is existentially bleak in a way that's hard to overstate. Most humans derive meaning from a combination of personal relationships, creative pursuits, contribution to community, and hope for a better future. Generation ship inhabitants in the middle generations have some of this, relationships and community within their small population, but their futures are completely determined. There's no possibility of a different life, a career change, moving to a new place, trying something radically different. There's only the ship, forever. Some might find meaning in the mission itself, in being part of something larger than themselves. Religion or philosophy might provide existential comfort. But over centuries, as Earth fades into mythology and the destination remains impossibly distant, that meaning might erode. You'd see the rise of nihilism, philosophical movements that question whether the mission has any meaning at all, perhaps religious cults that promise spiritual escape from the physical prison of the ship. And what happens to art and culture? On Earth, art is shaped by diverse experiences, by travel, by interaction with nature, by the vast complexity of human civilization. On a generation ship, all art is created in response to the same environment, the same metal walls, the same recycled air, the same few thousand faces. How long before music, literature, and visual art become repetitive and sterile? How long before creative spirits feel suffocated by the lack of new experiences to respond to? You might see art become increasingly abstract or inward-looking, focused on psychological states and philosophical questions because there's nothing external to draw from. Or you might see obsessive documentation of Earth as remembered or imagined, a culture fixated on a past they can never access. Or desperate fantasies of the destination, imagined paradises on Proxima Centauri b that become increasingly disconnected from whatever reality awaits. There's also the question of historical memory and how the truth of the mission might be distorted over time. The launch generation knows why they're on the ship, where they came from, where they're going. But oral history degrades. Details are lost, distorted, mythologized. By generation 20, 500 years in, how much of the original truth remains? You might have religious movements that have transformed the mission into sacred narrative, where Earth becomes a kind of Eden they were cast out from. and Proxima Centauri b becomes a promised land. Or conspiracy theories that the whole thing is a lie, that there is no destination, that they're actually part of some experiment or punishment. Without external sources of information, without the ability to verify anything beyond their immediate environment, the population becomes vulnerable to false narratives that might undermine the mission. This is why some proposals suggest regular communication with Earth, sending updates and receiving information even across the years of light-speed delay. But there are problems with this too. First, maintaining a communications link across light years requires significant energy and equipment. As the ship gets farther from Earth, the signal becomes weaker, requiring more powerful transmitters and receivers. Eventually, the distance becomes too great for practical communication. Second, even if you maintain the link, what do you communicate? Messages from Earth would take years to arrive. A question sent from the ship when it's 4 light-years out takes 4 years to reach Earth, and 4 more for the response to return. 8 years for a round-trip conversation. As the ship travels farther, this delay increases. By the time the ship is halfway to Proxima Centauri, communication delays might be decades long, making meaningful dialogue impossible. And what does Earth send? News about political events, technological developments, cultural trends? All of it arrives years or decades out of date, describing a world that no longer exists. This could be psychologically destabilizing, a constant reminder of the dynamic, changing civilization they left behind while they're stuck in stasis. Or Earth might go silent for any number of reasons. Civilization collapses, priorities change, the transmitters break down, or they simply decide the resources are better spent elsewhere. The silence would be devastating, confirming the ship population's worst fears about abandonment and isolation. Let's discuss economics, because someone has to pay for all this. A generation ship would be the most expensive project in human history by orders of magnitude. We're talking trillions of dollars, possibly tens of trillions, spent over decades or centuries of construction. That's money that could alternatively address climate change, cure diseases, eliminate poverty, develop fusion power, or any number of other projects with more immediate and certain benefits. Who pays? Individual nations can't afford it. Even wealthy countries like the United States or China would struggle to justify such expenditure with no near-term return. International cooperation seems necessary, but coordinating dozens of nations over the decades required to plan and build a generation ship is politically implausible. Governments change, priorities shift, public opinion fluctuates. A project that starts with enthusiastic support might be defunded halfway through when a new administration decides the money is better spent elsewhere. Private funding faces similar problems. Even the wealthiest individuals and corporations don't have the resources for a generation ship, and those that do didn't get wealthy by spending fortunes on projects with no financial return. You might get philanthropic funding for the initial research, but building the actual ship? The numbers don't work. Some have suggested that the real value of generation ship research isn't the ships themselves, but the technological spin-offs. Advances in life support, closed-loop ecology, radiation shielding, propulsion, psychology, sociology. This is the same argument made for the Apollo program, that getting to the moon was less important than the technology developed along the way. But this is an expensive way to drive innovation. If you want advances in life support, fund life support research directly. If you want better closed-loop ecology, build experimental habitats on Earth or in orbit. You don't need to commit to a generation ship to get technological benefits. In fact, focusing on the generation ship as a goal might distort research priorities, pushing development toward mission-specific solutions rather than broadly applicable technologies. There's also a moral argument about resource allocation. In a world where hundreds of millions of people lack clean water, adequate food, healthcare, and education, Is it ethical to spend trillions on a generation ship that benefits no one alive today? Even if you believe in the long-term value of human expansion into space, couldn't those resources do more good applied to immediate human suffering? The counter-argument is that humanity should be able to do both, address current problems while also investing in the future. But resources are finite, and choices have real opportunity costs. Every dollar spent on a generation ship is a dollar not spent on something else. It's a legitimate ethical question whether the uncertain, distant benefits of interstellar colonization justify the certain, immediate cost. Let's talk about what happens after arrival, assuming everything goes improbably well and the ship successfully completes its journey. The population has been isolated for 800 years. They've developed their own culture, language, values, potentially their own genetic characteristics, if they've been managing breeding for radiation resistance or other traits. They're human, but they're not the same humans who left Earth. Now they encounter Earth's civilization again, assuming Earth sent follow-up missions with faster technology, or assuming Earth is still transmitting signals the generation ship can receive. There's going to be massive culture shock on both sides. Earth has advanced technologically and socially for 800 years. The generation ship population is working with 800-year-old technology and has been living in isolation. They might seem primitive, backward, even pitiable to Earth humans. Meanwhile, Earth civilization might seem incomprehensible, decadent, or threatening to the generation ship population. This could lead to conflict. History shows us that encounters between technologically disparate cultures often go badly for the less advanced group. Would Earth's civilization respect the generation ship colonists' autonomy, or would they impose their own values and systems? Would the colonists welcome Earth's help and technology, or resist it as cultural imperialism? These are questions that could determine whether the colony succeeds or tears itself apart through internal and external conflicts. There's another scenario worth considering. What if Earth's civilization has collapsed by the time the generation ship arrives? 800 years is a long time. Civilizations rise and fall. The Roman Empire lasted roughly 500 years in the West, 1,000 in the East. The generation ship might arrive at Proxima Centauri only to find that Earth has gone silent, that the home civilization that launched them no longer exists or has regressed to a pre-industrial state. In this scenario, the generation ship population might be the only surviving representatives of technologically advanced humanity. They would carry the weight of preserving human knowledge and civilization entirely on their own, with no backup, no support, no possibility of rescue or resupply. That's a terrifying responsibility, and it makes every decision even more critical. One catastrophic failure doesn't just doom the mission, it potentially dooms the species. Let's consider the possibility that we're thinking about this entirely wrong. Maybe generation ships aren't the answer to interstellar travel at all. Maybe the answer is to wait, to develop technology that makes the problem easier, or even solves it entirely. Suspended animation or cryogenic freezing, if it can be made to work reliably for centuries, would eliminate most of the social and psychological problems. The crew sleeps through the journey, ages slowly or not at all, and wakes at the destination. You still need the ship and propulsion, but you don't need to maintain a multi-generational society in space. Alternatively, maybe we develop biotechnology that extends human lifespan dramatically. If humans could live for 1,000 years in good health, a single generation could make the journey. You'd still have psychological challenges, but you'd avoid the ethical problems of condemning unborn generations to life on a ship. Or perhaps we develop propulsion technology that makes the journey faster. Fusion rockets, antimatter engines, or more speculative technologies like Bussard ramjets or laser-pushed light sails might reduce travel time to decades instead of centuries. This doesn't eliminate the problems, but it reduces their scale dramatically. A 30-year journey is something a single generation could psychologically handle, more like a long military deployment than a multi-century exile. The most speculative possibilities involve physics we don't yet understand. Wormholes, warp drives, or other faster-than-light travel, if they're possible at all, would make generation ships obsolete. You could reach Proxima Centauri in days or months instead of centuries. But these technologies remain entirely theoretical, possibly prohibited by fundamental physics, and, even if they're possible, might require energy or exotic matter we have no idea how to produce. So where does this leave us? After examining the technical challenges, the biological problems, the social dynamics, the psychological toll, the ethical dilemmas, and the economic realities, what's the conclusion? Generation ships, as typically conceived, are probably not feasible with current or near-future technology. The technical challenges alone are immense, and we haven't even successfully demonstrated closed-loop life support on Earth, let alone in space for decades or centuries. The biological problems of radiation and low gravity remain unsolved. The social and psychological challenges might be insurmountable, requiring authoritarian control and violations of individual autonomy that modern ethics would reject. Even if we could solve all the technical problems, the question remains whether we should. The resources required are staggering, the risks are enormous, and the benefits are uncertain and accrue only to distant future generations. There are strong arguments that those resources would do more good applied to other purposes, either addressing Earth's problems or developing space infrastructure within our own solar system. But here's the thing, humanity does irrational things. We climb mountains because they're there, even though reaching the summit provides no practical benefit and kills a percentage of climbers. We spent fortunes sending people to the moon, primarily for ideological reasons, during the Cold War. We fund art and philosophy and pure mathematics that have no immediate applications. We do things because they're meaningful, because they represent human achievement, because they push boundaries. A generation ship might be irrational from a cost-benefit perspective and still be worth attempting if it represents something important about who we are as a species. The question is whether the symbolism and the long-term potential are worth the genuine suffering of the people who would live and die on that ship. My personal view, for what it's worth, is that we're nowhere near ready. We should focus on solving the technical problems step by step, develop better propulsion, prove closed-loop life support works, establish permanent habitats on the Moon and Mars, develop suspended animation, extend human lifespan, advance AI, build the prerequisite technologies and knowledge base, create infrastructure in our solar system, orbital habitats, asteroid mining, fusion power, whatever we need, to make interstellar missions economically and practically viable. Maybe in a few centuries, if we survive our current crises and continue advancing technologically, generation ships will become feasible in ways we can't currently envision. Or maybe we'll develop alternatives that make them unnecessary. Either way, launching a generation ship with 2020s or even 2060s technology would be condemning thousands of people to almost certain death in a flying coffin, and I don't think that's ethically justifiable no matter how inspiring the symbolism. But I could be wrong. Maybe someone will solve the technical problems. Maybe we'll develop social systems that can maintain cohesion over centuries. Maybe the first generation ship will launch in 50 years and successfully establish a colony at Proxima Centauri, proving all the skeptics, including me, wrong. If that happens, if humans establish themselves on another world orbiting another star, it will represent one of the greatest achievements in human history, a moment that defines our species as truly spacefaring. The people who make that journey will suffer enormously, but they'll also be remembered for as long as human civilization exists. That's worth something. Whether it's worth enough is a question each generation will have to answer for itself. The generation ship represents humanity's most ambitious and most troubling vision, for space exploration. It's a concept that forces us to confront fundamental questions about survival, ethics, identity, and purpose. It reveals both our species' remarkable ambition and our vulnerability. Perhaps the real value of thinking about generation ships isn't that we'll build them, but that the exercise forces us to think seriously about long-term survival, closed-loop ecology, social cohesion, and the ethics of decisions that affect generations not yet born. These are issues we face on Earth right now: climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, the legacy we're leaving for future generations. In that sense, the generation ship is a mirror. It shows us ourselves, our values, our willingness to sacrifice for the future, and our capacity for both visionary thinking and short-sighted hubris. Whether we ever build one or not, thinking deeply about what it would require tells us something important about who we are and who we might become.